The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Rob Ricigliano.
Welcome to International Focus. Today's topic, left turn in France. In a conspicuous change of direction, French voters have elected their first socialist president since François Mitterrand's re-election in 1988. François Hollande, a moderate 57-year-old rural social democrat, defeated incumbent Nicolas Sarkozy, making him the 11th European leader to lose power since the economic crisis in 2008. What were the uniquely French factors that propelled this self-styled Mr. Normal into power? And how do they align with larger trends sweeping across the EU? For analysis of this virage gauche, we're joined by a panel that includes two participants in the election and a scholar of European politics. Gabrielle Verdier wears many hats at UWM, including professor in the Department of French, Italian, and Comparative Literature, coordinator of the Master's Program in Language, Literature, and Translation, and associate director of the Center for International Education. She's also a community leader in the promotion of French language and culture. Sarah Davies Cordova is also a member of the faculty of the Department of French, Italian, and Comparative Literature. Jennifer Smith is assistant professor of political science at UWM, where her teaching interests include Western European politics, political parties, and social movements. Welcome to International Focus. I'm wondering if you could help us understand a bit about the background, so the context, what was going on in sort of the French society, the French electorate, in the months and the weeks leading up to this most recent election. Gabrielle, can you help us understand?
Well, I just want everyone to admire Mr. Normal, just in case you didn't see him. And I want to give everybody a rose, and the rose is because the rose with your clenched fist holding it is the emblem of the Socialist Party. And so I think that I have been writing back and forth to my French friends in Paris about the election. And I said, was it only a message to Sarkozy to, as they say, casse-toi, pauvre con? Sarkozy has angered a lot of people, for one thing, and not only because of his style, which is completely sort of schizophrenic. He goes back and forth, and then he consorts with the very rich, and he shows off his Rolex, and he goes on yachts and all that. But he also has an unfortunate way of treating people that was captured very early on in his presidency. And although this may seem like a very minor thing, at one of the most important events in all of the year in France, which is the Salon de l'Agriculture, the agricultural show, which brings all the provinces, all of the regional, and all of the politicians go to the Salon d'Agriculture, and they're photographed there, and they pet the cows, and they shake the hands of the farmers. Well, there was one farmer who refused to shake Sarkozy's hand, and so Sarkozy said to him, "Casse-toi, pauvre con," which means, how would you say it?
Get out of here.
Yeah, get out of here, you jerk. And that was caught on camera. But pauvre con was much worse than you jerk. And so that has trailed him, and the way, the cavalier way he treats people and so forth. But also a very, many promises that he made and he didn't keep, many lies that he told, and so forth. And I think that there was a general feeling of people getting fed up, and people of, lower income people feeling really the pinch of the recession and the cuts that he was trying to make and so forth. So I think that there was a general feeling of rejection of Sarkozy, even though, just so that everyone knows, he got 48.33% of the vote. Hollande got 51.67, which means a difference of 3.34%, which is not that great, but it's bigger than some margins that U.S. presidents have gotten. And by the way, 81.3% of the French people voted, which we can compare with our voting record, I think. So it means that people are very engaged in the political process.
Sarah, how would you see what is happening in current, let's say in the last year in France, is it compared to sort of other more tumultuous times when we've had a change in leadership in the past?
I don't know if it's necessarily just over the last year. I think it really is all 5 years of his term. And under Chirac, the term was reduced from 7 years to 5 years. And so it's been an intense 5 years on the part of Nicolas Sarkozy. But I think even it started in 2005, before he was elected in 2008, when there were the manifestations in the suburbs of Paris, and he was Minister of the Interior at the time, and there was various small events happened that triggered greater manifestations and car burnings and so on, and he said that we should go out there with high jet water
and
clean out
the fire hoses.
and les laver au Karcher. And that was sort of one of the most telling moments in terms of how he felt about those that were the least privileged in society, and largely the populations coming from the former colonies that tend to live in the surrounding suburbs of Paris. Completely different arrangement of city planning in France versus in the US, where the city centers are where the more wealthy, affluent people live, and then the suburbs being those where people with less economic means live. And so that sort of triggered it. And then there was, in 2008, he went to Dakar in Senegal and made le discours de Dakar, as it's become known, when he basically said that Africa needed to come up to the present time, come out of the black hole of history and come into modernism. And so this created a huge split in French opinion, because many of the people, most people in France that are from the colonies are now also French citizens, and they felt very much excluded by the kind of discourse that he held. So I think a lot of it was also this divide, not only economic, but also in terms of who he considered to be French, and in that way allying himself much more with the kind of discourse that comes out of the National Front with Marine Le Pen, rather than with something much more centrist, as Bayrou would probably take up. And Bayrou was one of the people that said after the first turn that he would give his vote to Hollande. He didn't say that his followers should necessarily, but that he would vote for Hollande.
Right.
So I think that's the other dimension that is really very strong. In the last 5 years, it's been getting worse and worse.
Jennifer, I wonder if you could give us the view from outside of France. I mean, how was Sarkozy viewed in the continent in general? So he became an increasingly polarizing and divisive figure within France. How was he seen outside of France?
Well, what is the European perspective? I suppose one of the major concerns coming out of this election is what the German reaction to a new leader in France is likely to be. Sarkozy did not always have an easy relationship, really, with Angela Merkel, but I think their relationship improved over time. They are both conservatives. They come from the major conservative parties in their countries, and they have been the driving force, the two of them, this sort of Merkozy axis behind some of the commitments that the European Union has made to managing government deficits, to committing to cutting spending in the Eurozone. And that is, in some ways, the biggest European question. Does Hollande's election have important implications for that set of policies? Is he going to want to renegotiate the so-called fiscal pact, so the commitment of 25 states in the EU to reduce spending, to hold their deficits down? Is this a signal that the European Union is backing away from the German perspective, from commitments that it's made? And certainly over the last couple of days, the government in Germany has come out and said, on the one hand, that they are embracing Hollande, that they intend to work closely with him. This is what you would always expect a German government to say about a new leader in France. But at the same time, that they are committed to the fiscal pact, that they believe that Europe has done the right things, and that they don't see anything to rediscuss.
So what are the expectations now? I mean, let's maybe looking within France and also from within Europe. You began going there, Jennifer, with how the rest of Europe, or certainly Germany, is thinking or expecting things to unfold now that Hollande is in power. What are people in France expecting from him? I mean, so they say my vote will have been worth it if. What happens?
Well, for one thing, he did say very clearly in his acceptance speech after the election that austerity is not the only answer. Okay, so that he didn't say there shouldn't be no more austerity. He couched it in a rather diplomatic way. Austerity is not the only answer. He's expecting that he's convening in July one of the Pacte de Solidarité or whatever, labor union leaders and leaders of capital, the patronat, to a big conference discussion of the state of the economy, and also very much wanting to support what the French really called solidarité. That means that everybody in the country is sort of responsible for everybody else in one sense. We're not pitting people against each other the way it's done in the States. You know, why should I pay for my next door neighbor's operation or something? Well, of course the French sometimes think that too, but they also think that a healthy population is the key to a prosperous nation. And so one thing he's proposing, or he may be proposing, is a bump up for the SMIC, which is the minimum wage. The minimum wage now is the equivalent of about $12 an hour, and it's raised every January 1st by law. But now in the middle of the summer, he may bump that up. But here, just another small thing, but that means a lot, I think, to a lot of French. The French government also gives parents of children an allocation, some money, at the beginning of the school year to help them buy school supplies for their children. And he is going to propose raising that by 25%. So every kid in France has the adequate supplies to go to school. Now, these are very small things, but I think they're meaningful for the French. And he also stresses that if austerity if there's no prosperity and no buying power, austerity will not work. And that's obviously what happened in Greece, yeah.
I mean, at the same time, Gabrielle calls these small measures,
yes.
And I think that is something to emphasize about them, that this is not a period in time now when you would expect, as the government moves from a right party to a left party, that that radical things will change in the management of the economy. I think Hollande faces the same sorts of challenges that Sarkozy did about the French welfare state. So how sustainable are is what the government has committed to in terms of retirement policy, in terms of working age, in terms of its efforts to reduce unemployment and to bring more young people into work. So on the one hand, I think that it is true that Hollande will set a solidarity emphasis, that he will try, maybe especially with things like the minimum wage, to redirect some of the policy focus from retirees to younger people, to do more for younger people. But at the same time, the broad set of things you would expect him to do is not so radically different from the broad set of things you would expect any government in a European country to be doing at the moment.
Right. And he's not by any means very leftist socialist or anything like that. He's not. And I think another thing that we should also point out is that we have, certain preconceptions about socialism and the French monarchical presidency and all that. But compared to Mitterrand, who came to power in 1981,
as the first socialist,
and who was actually a mentor to Hollande's freedom of maneuver is very much reduced. Number one, by European law, the laws of the European Union. All leaders, all the leaders have that reduction of independence, and also by the decentralization of France, which really has happened, and that was put into place under Mitterrand. So local governments have much more power now than they did 40 years ago.
We're just after a break, so I want to come back and sort of explore a little bit more about what President Hollande is going to face short-term and long-term. We'll be back in just a moment here on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about the recent French elections and the election of François Hollande. Sarah, I'm wondering if based on what we were hearing just before the break about the things that Hollande wants to do in the short term, but the constraints and the challenges he's going to face, Is this a sort of a be careful what you wish for situation? I mean, given the difficulties he has, which haven't really changed between President Sarkozy and his new administration, can he win? I mean, is this a no-win situation for him?
I think it's going to be very tough for any leader right now in Europe or in the US for that matter. I think one of the areas that we're going to watch for is in a month's time we're going to have the legislative elections. So we've got the Assemblée Nationale, the deputies that are going to be re-elected. I think it's 577 members of the Assemblée Nationale, and this is where Marine Le Pen is hoping to take advantage of her third position.
Give us a little background on Marine Le Pen and her party.
Marine Le Pen is the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, and Jean-Marie Le Pen started the Front National, or the National Front Party, in the 60s?
Yeah,
late
a long
60s?
time ago, yes.
Yeah. And this is the first time she's actually running as head of the party. And she came in third at the first round of the presidential elections with close on 18% of the vote, which is even higher than when her father came in second during the second mandate of Chirac.
Chirac, 2002.
In 2002, right. And so that was one of those key moments in French history when the French had a choice between the far right and the center right.
And in fact, a socialist president could have come in. Jospin was third, but by a fraction of a percent behind Le Pen. And one of the problems is that there were 16 candidates in the first round. And a lot of my leftist friends voted for somebody more to the left than Jospin. So their vote was right.
Right, which was what some of the fear was this year,
That's
because
right.
we could see Marine Le Pen was really gaining, and Sarkozy realized this also, and so he was leaning more to the right too, even in the first round. So the legislative elections coming up in June, we've got the first round on the 10th and the second round on the 17th of June, is when the Assemblée Nationale gets determined. And so one of the concerns obviously now for the Hollande team is to make sure that they get a majority in the Assemblée Nationale. They have the majority in the Senate. We have the second socialist president of the Senate since the fifth constitution. The first one was Gaston Monnerville, a black from Guyana, who would have been president had he stayed on one more year when de Gaulle resigned from his position in '68. But so we have the presidency and the Senate as being on the left. So now the next step, I think, is for the législative, because without the Assemblée Nationale, I think it's going to be even trickier for anything that François Hollande would like to put in.
Well, with the I don't know if you would call it a resurgence or the increased performance of the National Front and Marine Le Pen. Is this a real turn to the left? I mean, are we seeing a left and a right? I mean, how would you make sense of that, Jennifer? You look at this in the sort of broader context. Are you reading this as a significant turn to the left, or is it something else?
I would say no. I don't see a turn to the left in France, and also not in Europe broadly. I would say that two major things are happening in European elections at the moment. The first thing is that it is a bad time to be an incumbent. So governments in power are losing power in Britain, in Italy, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, in the Netherlands, in Ireland, in country after country. This is happening. And that is happening to conservative incumbents and social democratic incumbents both. So whichever party has been presiding over a very difficult economic time in Europe is tending to lose when it comes up for an election now. And the second thing that is happening, which I think you see in this French presidential election on the left and also the right, is a strengthening of the extremes. That voters are moving away from the established parties, which have very similar economic messages, increasingly in European countries, and also have tended to be the bedrock support of the European Union. So as voters are more skeptical about the European Union, skeptical about immigration, skeptical about austerity, that has increased the vote both on the far right and on the far left. You see that in France. You saw that very dramatically also this week in Greece. and in other European countries.
Gabrielle, how do you see this? I mean, is this, if you look more deeply into who voted which way and at what percentage, is this a true turn to the left? Is it an anti-incumbent spirit? How do you read the mood in France?
Well, by the way, I don't think that the extreme left did as well as it did in other countries, such as in Greece and France. I mean, the communists, the Lutte Ouvrière, had very small percentage. And Mélenchon, who was more to the left, a socialist, much more to the left than Hollande, had disappointing scores. It was really the Marine Le Pen vote, and that has to do with a lot to do with fear of the economic situation and people who are really hurting, sort of workers and so forth, manual labor and so forth. According to the profile of the electors, it's interesting to see that men and women were both exactly equal, which is different from what happens in the States. 52% of the men and 52% of the women voted for Hollande, and 48% for Sarkozy. Where Sarkozy got most of the votes was for the retired, 60 plus, and 60 plus, and people who are already retired, and artisans, small businessmen, and chef d'entreprise, where Hollande got 30 and Sarkozy got 70. But everybody else, in every other category, it was over 50%, sometimes 61% for Hollande. So I think it's the small business person, the artisan, and so forth, who was actually very, very much afraid of charge sociale, the kind of how would you call it? Charge sociale.
Deep structural social
Well,
change.
I mean, the kinds of things. If you do employ people, the
unemployment
benefits that have to be
healthcare
paid.
and so on.
So that is true, and that hasn't. I mean, that's not changed. I don't think.
And traditionally, also the peasants and the artisans were the ones who voted against Maastricht.
Yes.
In a strange alliance, it was the far right then and the far left that voted against Maastricht, against the European Union.
And that is a Europe-wide thing.
Yeah,
that
it
the
is.
parties of the center have been pro-EU, and the parties of both extremes have been anti.
So let's talk about the future. What do you expect? We just have about 4 minutes left or so to talk about a very big topic, the future. How do you, if you project ahead, Sarah, in terms of how you see Hollande coming into power, the legislative assembly elections, and so on, what do you expect to happen down the road? I know you don't have a crystal ball.
A big question there. I mean, I think he's going to face a lot of very, very difficult tasks. I mean, both internationally as well as at home. I mean, internationally, he's got a lot on his plate in Africa with the recent changeover of power in Senegal, the situation in Mali at the moment. We'll see how it works out in Ivory Coast, what's going on in Ivory Coast. And then obviously all of North Africa with the Arab Spring events playing out. And today is actually the anniversary also of the massacre in Constantine and in Algeria on the 8th of May 1945. So there's a lot going on. Tunisia with the change of power there, in Morocco moving towards somewhat more democratic ways going on in Morocco. So I think internationally he's got a lot, but at home he's got to somehow bring people together and be willing to work together to get over the economic austerity packages and be willing still to accept both austerity, I think, and some increasing tax at the upper level, which Sarkozy reduced quite a bit in some way in line with what goes on in the United States.
You began in your first comments talking about the German-French relationship. How do you see that going forward from this point on?
I think that both sides will work very hard to make it work. I think both Germany and France have a lot invested in the European project, in the euro, in the existence of a Franco-German axis and a close relationship between them. So I would expect both sides to try hard to find some sort of compromise. One thing that seems likely is that the the fiscal pact in the European Union, which I mentioned earlier, may be renegotiated not to change it, but to add some growth-promoting platforms. That's very common for the EU. Rather than discard what you've already done, you put something on top, and that becomes the new compromise position. So in that sense, I think some things are now up for discussion, but at the same time, I think both sides will continue to be very committed to good relationships between France and Germany.
Gabrielle, we have about a minute left. I thought I'd give you the last word. What are you hoping for?
Well, I'm hoping that he will succeed in many ways. I think that he has a tendency to bring people together, whereas Sarkozy's manner, his manner was to pit people against each other. And I think one other reason why Sarkozy was thrown out, he was pandering to the right to such an extent, and his party was recently, that many people said, this is not what France is all about. And the whole notion of solidarity sort of came up again as a theme. And
one thing that was really striking on Sunday evening was how everyone was just talking about, we're going to come back together. We're not going to be split. We're going to be, and it was people from all sorts of backgrounds that were all there together. And I think that was very, very striking as at least the hope for this to be a moment where we can come together and work together rather than being separated out economically, socially.
Well, speaking on that note, we need to wrap up. So maybe we can get together again in a year or so to assess the performance of the new president and see if your expectations and your analysis has proven out. To our viewers on International Focus, we'll see you next week. And to our panel, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220, or visit us at our website,